Hello, I am delighted to be joining you at the Qudwa Forum in Abu Dhabi this year to talk about global education. And I am grateful to the organizers of the forum who have provided each one of you with a copy of my book, Empowering Students to Improve the World in 60 Lessons, a curriculum resource aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals to help students from the first to the last grade of elementary and secondary school connect with real-world issues. My name is Fernando Reimers, and I am the Ford Foundation Professor of the Practice of International Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And in these remarks, I'm going to talk about why it is important to align the experiences that students have in school with the opportunity to understand, to care about, and to address issues that are both local as well as global, which are deeply intertwined in our times. Now, the notion that we should help students transcend the immediacy of their communities, of their surroundings, and become interested in everything that is human is not a new notion. At least 20 centuries ago, Terence, a former playwright in the Roman Republic, wrote something to the effect that to be human is to live, so that nothing human should be foreign to us. Let me repeat. To be human is to live so that nothing human is foreign to us. And 5 centuries ago, Montaigne, the very famous humanist writer, wrote a series of essays that expressed a very similar cosmopolitan aspiration for education. Indeed, I'd like to suggest that the goal of education has been, to the earliest times, to help students become interested in everything that is part of the human condition. But I think it is only more recently, as governments embrace the notion that everyone should be educated, that this goal, this cosmopolitan aspiration for education, became an important driver of efforts around the world available to all children. Now, why is it important to engage students with issues that are global? Well, there are a number of reasons. One is because engaging students with contemporary issues can help them develop a motivation around education, can help them understand why it is that what they learn in school is relevant to their lives. Second, engaging students with contemporary issues prepares them to be active, engaged, participatory citizens. It can activate motivation to learn. Too many students become uninterested in schools because they don't understand the purpose of what they're learning. They don't understand why what they're learning in school is going to be useful to them. Finally, affairs that are local as well as global are deeply interconnected. And all of you educators in the Emirates know this very well. 9 out of 10 persons who live in the Emirates come from a different place. So your society is, by virtue of the people who live in your territory, a very global society. And many of your schools have students who come from all kinds of cultural backgrounds, national backgrounds. And so it is part of the day-to-day experience of the students in your schools to understand that people have ties and connections and attachments to many different cultures and traditions. Finally, I'd like to suggest that in many schools, in many societies around the world, there are serious gaps in global awareness, even though we live in a time where nations are deeply interconnected, interdependent, because of migration of the sort that you experience in the Emirates, or because of communication technologies, or because of trade, or because of the simple availability of technologies that make it possible for students to become interested in what happens everywhere. There is a lot of ignorance over global affairs. Professor Hans Rosling, who used to work at the Karolinska Institute, discovered this first with his graduate students, how much about the world his graduate students did not know. And he designed a simple test, which he began to administer to college graduates in different societies, asking them questions such as, about how many people live on the planet? And In which continent do most of these people live? And over the last decade, has poverty increased, decreased, or stayed about the same? And he realized that the levels of knowledge of these basic facts were so low that he titled his test the Ignorance Survey. So that's just one indication of the fact that our schools and our universities could do a lot better than they currently do to educate all of our students to better understand the world in which we live. And I assume this is a challenge that those of you attending this conference recognize and are ready to embrace. So what I want to do in this short presentation is to offer an approach, a methodology to help you intentionally design curriculum that will help your students become, first of all, motivated by global affairs, second, become knowledgeable, and thirdly, become competent to be able to address issues that are local as well as global. So there are some who argue that it was only in 1947, when the first images of Earth were beamed back from the first satellites, that people began to develop this awareness, this notion that on this planet we're all in it together. And there are a number of issues that you will recognize, such as climate change, that clearly have no national borders. If we are going to be able to seize the short window of opportunity over the next decade to significantly slow down the rate at which the Earth is warming up, this is something that will require collaboration across all borders, shared goals, shared knowledge, shared capacities to collaboratively address this challenge. The adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights a year after those images were beamed back represents another expression of that aspiration that we should educate everyone to embrace a set of goals, a compact that can help us advance peace and security on this planet. And this 30-article document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, represents a vision of how to build a world that is inclusive, that is sustainable. A more recent vision, adopted at the General Assembly of the United Nations in the fall of 2015, is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which I will be referring to in a moment. But over the last 20 years, a number of organizations around the world, global organizations such as UNESCO, as well as national governments, have realized that with the development of technology and with the integration, the global integration of societies, it is very important that we expand the kinds of capacities that students have the opportunity to develop in schools. And you may be familiar with UNESCO's effort in the early 1990s, which was led by former European Commissioner Jacques Delors, the report Learning the Treasure Within, where over a 3-year period, Delors headed a global commission that engaged in hundreds of consultations around the world to agree on a framework of competencies that should drive education around the world. And he identified those capacities in 4 big categories: what he called learning to know, knowledge, learning to do, skills, learning to live together, the capacity to relate to one another, and learning to be, the capacity to know oneself and to manage oneself. Incidentally, UNESCO has just put together, for the first time since the Delors Commission, was established, another global commission to come up with a framework that can guide the work of the organization and of other development organizations over the next few decades. And I have the privilege to serve on that commission. So over the next couple of years, we're going to be producing, I suppose, a contemporary, a 21st century version of a similar report. There is a fair amount of consensus around the world that we need to be thinking expansively about those capacities. We need to be thinking about capacities, not just about knowledge of facts or even the capacity to use that knowledge to address problems, but capacities such as collaboration, flexibility, communication, social skills, cross-cultural skills. And I believe that global education is an excellent opportunity to bring to the schools, to create curriculum that provides an opportunity for students to develop that breadth of skills, that full range of 21st century skills, the capacities that Delors argued were essential to live and to engage in the 21st century. Now, my first suggestion is that such efforts in schools, the efforts to design intentional global citizenship curriculum, could find a wonderful point of entry in the 17 goals adopted at the General Assembly of the United Nations in the fall of 2015. Why? Because these 17 goals represent a very ambitious, a very hopeful vision of what it would mean to create a world in which we can all coexist peacefully and in which we can relate to one another and to the earth in ways that are sustainable. Furthermore, such compact provides a universal language that is now spoken by governments, by civil society, by individuals around the world. So as you educate your students who spend part of their careers in schools in the Emirates, but who may move as their families move and continue their education elsewhere, to align your efforts in education, your efforts to make them global citizens, with a universal framework such as the UN SDGs, would make it more likely that as they transition to other school systems, they will encounter efforts similarly aligned with these goals. These goals have, again, no passport, like the challenges, the global challenges that we share. There are, of course, in addition to hopeful goals, also serious global risks that our students must understand and be prepared to act upon, to address. And one summary of those risks is produced every year by a group at the World Economic Forum that produces a report called the Global Risk Assessment Framework. And some of the risks identified in the last edition of the Global Risk Assessment Framework include, these are the top trends that will determine, according to this expert group, global developments. And they are rising income and wealth disparity, changing climate, increasing polarization of societies, increased cyber dependency, and an aging population. And the interconnections between those risks are going to shape contemporary affairs in many societies. For example, unemployment and underemployment are going to exacerbate social instability as larger numbers of people feel excluded in the social contract. Large-scale involuntary migration, a product in part of climate change, will pose serious challenges in states and can lead in some cases to state collapse or state crisis. Failure of addressing climate change is going to cause major dislocations, water rising in cities, different places. The failure of national governance to address some of these issues will exacerbate instability, social instability. And interstate conflicts are going to have regional consequences and may in turn feed back and produce further migration. We're living at a time, as you know, where about 60 million people are involuntary migrants, refugees, people who have had to leave because the conditions in the places where they were born were unbearable, in part because of some of these developments. So I would argue that your students, my students, all need to understand these risks, all need to care about them, and all need to have the skills to make a contribution to addressing these issues. This is what I mean when I say we need to educate global citizens. A global citizen is a person that understands that these problems are not someone else's problem. There is no one else who's going to take care of these problems but us. So there are, as you know, as societies also become more diverse and as people are not given the opportunity to understand that diversity as an opportunity, as a positive opportunity, there are potential risks that can come from the coming into contact of different groups. So, for example, these are data from the World Values Survey, which administers these surveys to representative samples of the population every 10 years or so. And they ask them all kinds of questions, such as, for example, to what extent do you think that in educating young children, we should cultivate tolerance and respect for other people? And these are the results for only a small number of selected countries. And the good news about the answers to that question that these representative samples provide is that most people think that young children should be educated to be tolerant and respectful of others who are different, but not everybody. And furthermore, the percentage of those who don't think this is an important value seems to be increasing. So, take, for example, Australia. About 90%, 87% of the population thinks that, yes, children should be educated to be tolerant and respectful of others. In Brazil, that's a lower percentage, 7%. Chile, a little higher, 80%. China, a little lower, 50%, and so on and so forth. But as I mentioned, that figure used to be higher. So, for example, in China, 10 years ago, 70% of the population used to think that tolerance and respect for others who are different was a value. But in the most recent version of the survey, that figure is only 50%. So there's a 20% drop. Similarly, in South Korea, that figure used to be 65%, and that figure is now 40%. Similarly, in Singapore, that figure used to be 70%. That figure is now 55%. And in the United States, that figure used to be 80%, and that percentage is now 70% in the United States. These are data from the same survey where people are asked, to what extent do you trust someone who has a different religious faith to the one that you do? And what we see is that the percentage of people who say that they would trust completely someone of a different faith is actually rather small, below 10% in this sample of countries. If we extend the definition of trust to those who would say, not that they would trust completely, but that they would trust somewhat, then the percentage is much, much greater. It's up to 70% in Australia, but there's still a 30% of the population that really wouldn't trust at all, or not very much, someone who has a different faith. So I would argue that in a time when people are on the move, when people are migrating, where people have to collaborate across lines of religious difference, this form of discrimination based on faith is an obstacle to our capacity to address climate change. Addressing climate change is going to require people across all kinds of faith to come together and trust each other enough to be able to collaborate in putting in place the changes that we need to put in place to slow down climate change. Same is true for nationality, trust based on nationality. Same is true for accepting that people have different religion. So let me just very briefly provide the context out of which this methodology to develop curriculum aligned with the SDGs comes from. I lead at Harvard an effort, a cross-national effort called the Global Education Innovation Initiative. And our goal is very simple, is to figure out how it is that people, teachers, and leaders practice an education that helps students gain the capacities they need in the 21st century. And we do that in three ways. We do that conducting studies of educational programs, policies, and practices that are about advancing 21st century education. We promote dialogue and learning across different groups of stakeholders to get them to develop a shared vision on how to advance education for the 21st century. And lastly, we develop simple tools, simple protocols, such as this book, that can help teachers figure out how to implement in practice different pedagogies that can help students gain that breadth of skills. These are the countries where we have conducted our work up until now, the countries where we have conducted our research, although we have conducted research in countries other than those. So we have so far published 3 books, and we have 2 additional books now under publication. The first one is an analysis of curriculum and an analysis of the role that national curriculum frameworks have in guiding teachers towards the development of this breadth of skills. The second one is a study of very high quality programs of teacher preparation that can build the capacities of teachers to educate the whole child. And the third one, perhaps of interest to those of you at this conference, is a study of programs of entrepreneurship education in 6 different countries in the Middle East, including in the Emirates. This is an impact evaluation of the INJAS program that documents what it is that students learn as a result of having the opportunity to create a company while they're in high school. These are examples of some of the informed dialogues. These informed dialogues are basically convenings of people who are all engaged in practice for the purpose of helping them articulate what it is that they have learned from their practice that is useful to advancing a 21st century education. So our most recent book, titled Letters to a New Minister, contains a series of letters from former ministers of education who led very ambitious reforms of the curriculum of teacher education. And what they do in these letters is name what surprised them in leading those efforts. What do they wish they had known on day one? And lastly, we develop these curriculum resources, of which we have produced three books, all of them available to you in English, and actually 2 of them now available in Arabic. So the first one is a full 350-unit curriculum framework aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This book has just been published to Arabic, and you could all obtain copies of this book either in English or in Arabic. I'll be saying a few more words about that book. The second book is a simpler set of 60 lessons, 5 per grade, from grade 1 to grade 12, also aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So the difference between these two is this book contains units which are at a higher level of development. Each unit requires 10 to 20 different lessons. This one has only 60 lessons. And the third book contains 7 different curriculum approaches to align with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and some of them align specifically to addressing climate change. I'm going to talk a little bit about the principles that guided the development of the World Course, which are the same principles that guided the development of these 60 lessons. So the first one, the first set of principles was basically begin with the end in mind. Name the competencies that you hope students will gain, the full range of competencies I was mentioning a moment ago. Number 1, develop pedagogies that are action-based, that put students in groups and give them the opportunity to collaborate so that they develop knowledge that is personal, that they own. Third one, the emphasis is on active-based learning, on doing. Emphasize not only the development of knowledge, but also the development of skills and dispositions, attitudes. Each of these courses that take place over an entire grade conclude with a substantial, a demanding project that the student produces. So these are not short units, but these are extended projects over the entire year, so that at the end of the project, the student has produced something. That something can be a research paper, it can be a civic engagement project, and it could be a business plan. There are coherent yearly themes that guide this curriculum. The units that are involved in helping students address these global themes are interdisciplinary. There is much here that is new with respect to what curriculum normally includes around the world. And the purpose of these is to foster the agency, the initiative, the ability and the desire to make a difference, the leadership on the part of our students, their entrepreneurial skills, their creativity. The idea is to help them learn from what works, as well as from challenges, to help them develop an innovative and entrepreneurial spirit. Parents and the community are seen as resources that are brought in for the purpose of helping students develop these year-long projects. The emphasis is in developing a range of capacities, especially these capacities some of you might call 21st century capacities, or cognition plus social-emotional skills. The global challenges are the focus, the Sustainable Development Goals. There are many connections made in these units between global affairs and local affairs. The idea is to help students engage with issues that are complex, that don't have simple answers. The curriculum is age-appropriate, but it is not infantilizing. It begins with the premise that children are smart. And the curriculum goes from what is personal and immediate to more advanced and conceptual understandings. So basically, we developed this curriculum beginning putting together this framework of desired competencies, then identifying the various knowledge domains, developing a curricular sequence, putting together a scope and sequence for each grade, and then ensuring that there was coherence within grade and across grades. Then we developed each of the units. We went through multiple iterations of revisions. This curriculum has now been taught in thousands of schools by thousands of teachers around the world in many different countries. Basic principle was to combine the creation of new curriculum with repurposing and adapting curriculum which already existed and which had been tested. This framework of the characteristics of a graduate we offer essentially as a provocation. The goal is not that you should necessarily adapt this framework. The goal should be that this may be easier than beginning with a blank page. You can begin a process in a school and a conversation around this particular framework of competencies. And we say, well, they can be grouped in these categories. There is a category called intercultural competency, which includes interpersonal, intrapersonal, and ethics. There's knowledge and skills in the fields of economic, trade and demography, culture, politics, science, technology, public health and demography, business entrepreneurship, and finally a series of work and mind habits. For each one of them, we then further specify a total of about 200 of these capacities to make it very clear what is it that we need to see at the end when students graduate that will demonstrate competency. For example, an example of interpersonal competency, the student is able to recognize and weigh diverse cultural perspectives. Students can understand their own identity as well as the identities of others and how cultures shape our own identity and the identities of others, and so on and so forth. And the beauty of engaging a group of teachers in a careful discussion of each of those capacities is that once there is a shared view of what it is we're trying to do, it becomes so easy to audit, to examine the existing curriculum in the school and to identify ways to improve it, to incrementally improve it. And that is essentially what this process proposed in this book, in these 60 lessons, is about. It's a process to help a team of teachers within a school, and ideally a range of schools, collaborate as a network where teachers agree on a framework of competencies aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, then examine the curriculum that exists, identify a way to challenge themselves to do a little bit better, do that over the next year, evaluate that, share their learning across the various schools in the network, and then set further challenges for the year ahead. And in this way, if you have 10 schools in that network, you're making it possible for every school each year to gain 10 years of experience, to benefit from the collective intelligence that exists in this network as a result of using a common framework, a common approach, a common language. So I hope that this book will be useful to those of you in this conference. I hope that you will use the time in the conference to orchestrate, to organize some of these improvement networks, and I look forward to hearing from you, perhaps a year from now, and learn about the results that you have achieved in putting in place your own programs to educate global citizens. Thank you.